last year because Professor Williams was in Belize studying prisons. Yeah, I know. He was probably also doing a little scuba diving as well, but he said it was because he really did have a conference and a presentation to do. We showed a video of a lecture he had given the year previously, and Eric pointed out to me today that in the my introduction to him, I said that I would have liked to have hit him with my cane for not being there. I apologize.
That's okay.
Posterity. Surprisingly, students responded very well to what I consider to be one of our best in-home lecturers. How many? He is professor in the CCJS department. And I said I was going to make this a short introduction, but I would like to call your attention to the fact, and we're very proud about this, he has just, and I've seen it in reality, so it's really true, published his book, Big House in a Small Town, Prisons, Communities, and Economics in Rural America. And for those of you who have done research papers, you can imagine what it is to finish a book and to get it published, and to get it published by a pretty good publisher. Will you please join me in welcoming Professor Williams?
So it's nice to be here in person. It is. It's a strange thing that the YouTube video, getting it out, it's sort of, you never want to watch yourself lecture. You just don't. And it's bad enough watching yourself lecture. It's worse when people you care about watch you lecture. And I had a very interesting experience having this video up on YouTube because first my brother decided to watch it, and he's my older brother, as some of you can appreciate if you have older brothers. And so he called me up with notes to critique me. And he's like, so at minute 2, you do this thing with your hand where you rub the top of your head. Aren't you bald enough already? You don't need to do that. At minute 17, you sort of look kind of nervous. What was going on there? And I'm like, thanks, Danny. So he did that. And then my then girlfriend and current fiance, who actually happens to be here, she was like, you do this weird thing with your water bottle. And I'm like, what weird thing with my water bottle? And she goes, well, in the middle of the lecture, you grab your water bottle, you pull it close, you take the cap off, you hold it there for a couple seconds, you put the cap back on, you put it down. So I'm trying really hard, like this time, if anyone sees it on YouTube, that I won't do that again. I told that story once before when I was giving a lecture, and I guess the minute I picked up my water bottle, like several students in the audience were like murmuring to the people next to them, like, drink, come on, drink. So I hope you don't do that. So anyway, I'm here to talk about the legacy of Nuremberg and international war crimes tribunals. And this is a lecture that's kind of near and dear to my heart. I don't teach Holocaust studies. One of the, I would say, most important moments in my life that I recall, when I was 9 years old, I met Elie Wiesel, the author of Night. He came to my hometown of Bangor, Maine, and given that there are about 6 Jews in Bangor, Maine, he actually came to our house, and I got to meet him. And I remember how moved I was by that. And then I read Night after that. I hadn't read it before. And from that moment on, I was always fascinated by the Holocaust, and read a lot of sort of memoirs of the Holocaust. And there we go with the head thing. But in later life, doing my research, I started researching prisons, and I studied the law. And so what I became interested in terms of the Holocaust was what do you do with the perpetrators of a crime that great? What do you do after the fact? And so I became really interested and started reading up again about Nuremberg. And when Myrna approached me my first year here about doing a lecture, I was really excited at the prospect of doing a lecture on Nuremberg and then what came from Nuremberg. So today, did that work? There we go. I don't use PowerPoint a lot, so we're going to do our best. We're going to talk about how the Nuremberg trials came to be. That's sort of where we're going to start from. I then want to talk about the Nuremberg main trial, and I'll explain in a second why it is I sort of split it up that way into main trial and subsequent trials. We'll talk briefly about the 12 Nuremberg trials that came after the Nuremberg main trial. Then we're going to go through and talk a little bit about the sort of successors to Nuremberg. Starting in 1992, there have been several international criminal tribunals of various sorts. One for the war crimes in Bosnia, one for the genocide in Rwanda, and eventually the formation of the International Criminal Court, which had its statute passed in 1998 and became a real court in 2002. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the lessons of Nuremberg and the successor courts. So that just sort of gives you an overview of what it is that we're going to talk about. Nuremberg it's actually 13 trials took place in Nuremberg. It wasn't just one trial. When people hear about the Nuremberg trials, they tend to think of the big one, which was the main trial of the Nazi leaders. There were actually 12 trials that took place after that. And even though they were of lesser importance on the world stage, in some ways they're the ones that sort of set the precedents for the trials that we have now in terms of war crimes. The main trial was held in 1946. It was held in the rubble of the town of the city of Nuremberg in the Palace of Justice, and it was the first time that an actual international criminal trial took place. So you had the United States, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and France getting together to put on trial German war criminals. And it was the first time that had ever happened. Before that, there had been a few war crimes tribunals in Constantinople following World War I. There was a small trial in Germany, but none of them really had the might of the international community behind them. And so this was the first time really the international community came together and said, we're going to put people on trial for waging aggressive war and for crimes against humanity. And so it's special because of that. And then, as I said, the 12 cases that came afterwards, each case had sort of a focus. So they did one on the Nazi doctors. Unfortunately, Josef Mengele wasn't there, but other Nazi doctors who did experiments on Jews and Gypsies. There was one on the lawyers. There was one on the judges. There was one on the industrialists. What do you do with the people who ran the rubber plant at Auschwitz? How do you deal with those people that actually use the slave labor? That's what the industrialists went on trial for. And also the SS Einsatzgruppen, which were the mobile killing units that went around especially in the former territories of Russia and Poland and slaughtered over 1 million people. So those are the main Nuremberg trials. Just to give you sort of a timeline of when things went on, there were a series of meetings between the leaders. France wasn't really involved in these meetings, but in the leaders of the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom to try to decide how they were going to deal with the Germans after World War II ended. You know, they were very concerned that if they didn't do something big, that the Germans were going to do this again. And they had pretty good reason to fear that. You know, they had just, World War I was fresh in their memories. All three of these leaders were alive during World War I. They had a mini war crimes trial after World War I. Not much got done. And so 20 years later, here you are with Hitler taking over, and now you have World War II and these atrocities that take place. And so the three leaders were pretty clear that something big needed to be done to stop other people from doing this in the future, and also to punish the Germans for what it was that they did. At Yalta, they finally signed an agreement that outlined the idea of doing something. They weren't very specific on what it was they wanted to do. They were pretty clear that they were going to win the war against Germany at that point. They knew they needed to do something. They just didn't know what. So they knew that they were going to all get together and try to do something. A lot changed a couple months later. That was February 11th. On April 12th, Dachau is liberated by the United States. And this is a huge moment in terms of this sort of crimes against humanity component of the trials. It was the first time American soldiers, and eventually the American public really saw what it was that the Germans were doing. They showed a video at the Nuremberg trial that you can actually watch on the internet. I don't watch it if you don't have a strong stomach, where they actually show Dachau and what had happened inside. And those pictures came back to the United States. They were shown on newsreels. And it was really the first moment that America kind of goes nuts. America realizes just how bad this was. Before that, the American government certainly knew that something was going on. They knew mass killings were happening. But it was really the photos of it, it was soldiers seeing it, that they really realized how awful this was and what they were dealing with. At the end of April, Hitler commits suicide. Much to the chagrin, I think, of most of the leaders. They really wanted to put him on trial. He killed himself in his bunker. And right after Hitler commits suicide, it's coincidental, but you see how serious, at least the United States is, about putting Nazi war criminals on trial when they enlist the help of Justice Robert Jackson. A Supreme Court justice is now tagged to be the lead prosecutor at these trials. They're not messing around. When you take a Supreme Court justice and you say, you're going to take a year off from the Supreme Court, this is more important, everybody knows you're serious. And it also, putting Jackson in this role really sort of shifted the focus from what some people were thinking of doing versus what it was the United States wanted to do. Churchill really, he wanted to do something big. He did not want to do a trial. What he wanted to do was sort of run around the battlefield, catch Germans, determine who they were in about 6 hours, and then shoot them. Summary executions. He had assumed that they would kill about 5,000 people doing this. And he wanted it done by the end of 1945. And he told all of his people that this was what he wanted to do. It's called drumhead justice. Let's just find the leaders and kill them. Stalin at a cocktail party, interestingly, Stalin liked to drink a little bit. Stalin was also very loud, and he was saying that he had shown in the Soviet Union that you could kill mass amounts of criminals, quote unquote, in trials as long as you didn't let them actually defend themselves. And these are called show trials. And Stalin managed to kill tens of thousands of people in show trials while he was in the Soviet Union. And so he, at this cocktail party, said, let's just find 50 to 100,000 Germans who we think were involved. We'll put them up on trial, we'll take them out back, and we'll shoot them. So this was what the Soviet Union and the United Kingdom had in mind. The United States had something else in mind. And by putting Robert Jackson on the prosecution team, they showed how serious they were in actually backing a plan to have a real trial. But even FDR wasn't quite sure what he wanted to do. And so I've listed a couple of the different American plans that Roosevelt was listening to. The first plan came from Henry Morgenthau, who was the Secretary of Treasury and a very close friend of the president's. Morgenthau was Jewish. And when he saw what was going on, he was horrified. And so he had this idea that Germany was really the problem, that Germany should not be allowed to do this anymore, and that the way to get justice was through real retribution. So he wrote up a plan and sent it to the president. He said, we should take the top 2,500 Germans we find and kill them on the spot. So he was about as warm and fuzzy as Stalin and Churchill were. He said that they should take anyone who was a member of the SS or the SA, put them in concentration camps and make them into slave labor. And then they should deindustrialize Germany. They should turn Germany into an agricultural state. So Germans could, make wine like they did, or they could grow crops, but they couldn't have any industrialization whatsoever. That the problem was really Germany, according to Morgenthau. The Secretary of War, Stimson, wasn't so crazy about this idea. Stimson, as Secretary of War, was most concerned about this idea that what the Nazis did was wage an illegal, aggressive war. That what they did to Poland, what they did when they went after the Soviet Union, despite having signed a treaty with them, what they did when they invaded France, this is what needed to be dealt with. It wasn't about the atrocities at Dachau. Those are horrifying, sure. But you know what? We need to stop other countries from thinking that they can do that too. And so what Stimson came out with was you have to have a real trial in which you have a real law that the Nazis broke when it was they went forward and took over Poland and then eventually the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, and every place else that the Nazis went. And so he enlisted a Columbia law grad who worked for him named Murray Bernays and told Murray Bernays, come up with a plan of how we can do this. How is it we can put these people on trial? Because there's a big problem with just putting people on trial, which is they have to have done something wrong. They have to have broken a law. Well, there's no such thing, certainly at this time, as international law. So, and the Germans were meticulous. Before they stripped the Jews of their citizenship, what did they do? They passed a law saying we can strip the Jews of their citizenship. And so they stripped the Jews of their citizenship. Before they went into Poland, they took it over. They said, this is occupied territory. It's under military command. Therefore, there's a state of emergency in Poland. Therefore, we can do whatever we want. And they did whatever they want. And so there was no law that the Germans broke. And this was a big problem because if you're legalistic, if you're somebody like me who's sort of a law nerd, if you're going to put somebody on trial, you have to be able to say at the time that they did the thing that was wrong, they had to know it was wrong, right? And so worse than that, you want to put people on trial for what's called an aggressive war. Well, who's involved in an aggressive war? The state, the sovereign. If you want to say that we were involved in an aggressive war in Iraq, whether you think that or not, just Iraq didn't attack us. We went in there. It could be considered an aggressive war. Well, if you're mad about the aggressive war, can you put you guys on trial because you were United States citizens at the time that we went into Iraq? Well, no. Can you put the government of the United States on trial? Well, what does that mean? Like you take Congress and put them on trial as Congress because they voted for the authorization for the use of military force? Like, what does that even mean? So they broke a treaty. How do you put a state, how do you put a country on trial? And so Stimson told Bernays, come up with a theory of law that works. Come up with something that we can justify to put individuals on trial for the actions of a state. And Bernays, who was really, really brilliant in his own way, came up with this idea that you treat the Nazi Party like you would treat the mafia. Okay? So John Gotti, you guys remember who John Gotti is, or am I talking like dated stuff that you don't? You guys, Gambino crime boss? Okay. John Gotti isn't going to go pull the trigger. He's not going to kill somebody who owes the Gambino crime family money. What's he going to do? He's going to send somebody out to do it for him, right? Because he doesn't want to get his hands dirty. He doesn't want to get caught. So how is it that you convict John Gotti for what it is that his underlings do? You call it a criminal conspiracy. You say John Gotti and his underlings created a conspiracy that was involved in committing murder. And once you've done that, it's brilliant as a point of law. Once you've said they're involved in a criminal conspiracy, then all of a sudden you can go after individuals and say you're involved in this criminal conspiracy, even though you might not have known what was going on in Auschwitz. You made sure the train from Czechoslovakia to Auschwitz ran on time. You made sure the process moved forward. You were involved in the criminal conspiracy. So it's a two-step process. You first prove that the Nazis and their underling groups, the SS, the SA, the Einsatzgruppen, that these are criminal enterprises. And then anyone who's involved in these criminal enterprises is guilty for being involved. They've committed conspiracy to commit murder and crimes against humanity. And so this was sort of the Bernays plan. And as it turns out, it was so brilliant that Roosevelt, and then after Roosevelt died, Truman and Jackson really liked it. Because from a legal standpoint, it's justifiable. Because this was a big problem for them, that they had to justify this war. So, going on back to my timeline, Germany surrenders unconditionally on May 8th. On August the 8th, 1945, the Allies create the London Agreement. And the London Agreement actually creates the criminal charges through which the Nazis are going to be charged. Sorry for my redundancy. They use this idea of the giant conspiracy. They use Bernays' idea almost to a T. They figure out how they're going to do it. There's going to be a prosecution. You're going to allow a defense. It's going to be a real trial. But the French and the Soviet Union were not particularly happy with an idea of a jury, which is what we do when we put people on trial. And so what was agreed to in London was that there would be some sort of quasi-continental, quasi-Anglo-Saxon court. So you would have the judges making the decision. The judges would be allowed to ask questions, but it would be adversarial. So you would have a prosecution team and a defense team. We all know what that looks like. Everybody's seen Law and Order at least once in their life. You know what a prosecution and defense, they fight it out, you decide who did it. And instead of a jury actually deciding, it's the judges. And so they appoint actually two judges, one main judge, one alternate judge, from each country to sit. And so they set up exactly how it is that they're going to do this. They indict 24 men. 22 actually stood trial. One man, Robert Lake, killed himself before they had a chance to put him on trial. They tried Hitler's secretary, Martin Bormann, in absentia. They thought he was just running. It turns out he was dead, they're pretty sure. So they didn't have to hang him because he was already dead. And they put these 22 men, as it turns out, on trial in Nuremberg. And the Nuremberg site was chosen for some good reasons. First off, Nuremberg, as much as any place else in Germany, was sort of the emotional soul of Nazism. The Nuremberg laws, have they learned about the Nuremberg laws? The Nuremberg laws were passed there. It was a place where Hitler held huge rallies. And the other thing that was great about Nuremberg as a site was that they had this palace of justice, this huge courtroom, with a 1,200 person prison in the back, and it was almost intact. Very little work actually needed to go into the site. And so between the fact that it was sort of the heart and soul of Nazism and the fact that it had an actual intact courtroom, it made it kind of perfect. And it became very obvious sort of early on, after they got there and after they indicted the 24 men, that really this was Justice Jackson's show. The Americans got almost everything they wanted. The reason they got almost everything they wanted is because they had most of the Germans. So it helps when you have the people that you want to put on trial in prison camps already. They also had most of the documents. And so the Americans were sort of like, well, if you want to put on a trial, you're going to do it our way. And so Robert Jackson is chief prosecutor, and it sort of runs the way that Justice Jackson wants it to run almost from the start. So these are the big charges. There are actually four. I've moved it in to three because one is the crime against peace and then the criminal conspiracy. They sort of go hand in hand. And so there are three main charges. The first one is crimes against peace. That's waging an aggressive war. I'm going to go into Poland, I'm going to take it over, and I'm going to start killing all their Jews. Okay? So that's an aggressive war. That's charge number one. Charge number two are war crimes. War crimes are specifically how you treat enemy soldiers. The Germans treated American soldiers fairly well. They didn't treat Russian soldiers so well. They killed a lot of Russian POWs. And prisoners of war, there are these things called the Geneva Conventions, and prisoners of war are supposed to be treated in a humane fashion. Well, they didn't treat them in a particularly humane fashion by mowing them down. And so they committed war crimes. So that was the second charge. The last charge, and it really was the last charge, even though it's the one that we think of most, is for crimes against humanity. And the crimes against humanity is the one that we think of, the Holocaust. Killing the gypsies, killing the Jews, having your Einsack group and go into Eastern Europe and kill 1 million people. That's without the concentration camps. Those are the crimes against humanity. The crimes against humanity was an absolutely new charge. No one had even ever thought that you would charge people with this, but because the atrocities were so great, they decided that it needed to be done. Unfortunately, there are some big issues. One I've already talked about. How is it that can you hold individuals accountable for the actions of their state? So, using my Iraq as example again, if you think that we waged aggressive war in Iraq, all right, maybe you can put Bush on trial for that, maybe Don Rumsfeld, maybe Cheney if you're pretty creative. Can you put the generals who actually carried out the orders on trial? And that was a big question, and a lot of people argued that you can't do that. Okay? The other big issue was that the laws were what we call ex post facto. And this is a fairly common problem in any kind of common law system. We actually don't allow ex post facto laws. It's in the Constitution. If I wanted to embarrass a couple of my students, I'd make them pull out their pocket constitutions and actually show you where it says. Do you know where it says? No? Okay, great. Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution says you can't pass a law that makes something illegal that somebody did last week. You can't make things retroactive like that. Murder's either illegal at the time I kill somebody or it's not. You can't, let's say, ecstasy is actually, I don't know why this just came into my mind, that's bad, is actually a really good example of that. Ecstasy is a drug, most of you know what ecstasy is. It wasn't illegal for a long time because it was made up of chemical compound. The chemical compound wasn't made illegal for about 5 or 6 years after it came out. So you can't pass a law and say, not only is ecstasy illegal from now forward, but anyone who was selling ecstasy 3 months ago, we're also going to bust. You can't do that. That's called an ex post facto law. It's after the fact. And what a lot of people argued, and what a lot of people still argue, is that the charges at Nuremberg were essentially ex post facto in nature. That you were saying something is illegal that they did last week. And that's not okay to do in any kind of legal system. The London Agreement also set up how you deal with the defendants and how you let them put on a defense. The first thing that they had to discuss was, who do you let them bring in as lawyers? Almost every lawyer in the country was a member of the Nazi Party. If they weren't a member of the Nazi Party, they probably weren't alive. Or they weren't practicing law anymore, or they weren't in Germany anymore. So were you going to let them use former Nazis as their lawyers? And they realized that it was just, it wouldn't work otherwise. So you just had to let them do it. So about half of the defendants had former Nazi Party members as lawyers. The other problem is these defenses that I put up there that are allowed in a common law system. So they're allowed in an American court. The first one is tu quoque. I don't expect you to ever remember that, but that's the Latin term for it. It roughly translates as you did it too. So one of the defenses you can make in court in the United States, if somebody charges you in a civil matter with something, if somebody tries to sue you for something, you can say, well, you did it too. And it's a defense. It's actually a defense. Well, what they didn't want was the Germans coming in there and saying, well, you committed war crimes too. Look at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You killed... What just happened? Did I turn this off? It is, yes, absolutely. Can you hear me? Okay. You can't just say the United States did it too. Or you can't, Goering can't get up there and go, you know what? You know how you have New Mexico now and Arizona as a part of your country? How do we have New Mexico and Arizona? Because we attacked Mexico. We took them over. Isn't that an aggressive war? Do we really want Goering getting up there in a court and going to the United States? Well, guess what? You did it too. The United Kingdom has tons of colonies all across the world. Do we really want them pointing out our somewhat hypocritical way of doing things? So they said, you can't argue that. That's the best way to deal with that issue. You can't argue that you did it too. The other thing that they couldn't argue is something called duress, or I was just following orders is probably the best way to put that. Which means essentially, if I'm a Nazi general and I want to say the only reason I carried this out is because if I didn't carry it out, Hitler would have killed me, we didn't allow them that defense. They argued it in court, but the judges gave it very little merit. And so the London Agreement sort of set up a system that in some ways the deck was stacked against a lot of the Nazis to begin with, but in a lot of ways it was not. So this is Chief Judge Lord Geoffrey Lawrence from the United Kingdom. Francis Biddle, the United States main judge, had assumed he would be the main judge, but Jackson convinced him that they needed to let somebody else play, and that the United States had enough of the big positions and he should just allow himself to be a judge. And so they appointed Lord Geoffrey Lawrence as the chief judge. He was actually fabulous. People didn't think much of him at the time. He was sort of appointed as a judge because he was a member of the House of Lords and he was a judge. He hadn't had a particularly distinguished career. He was fabulous in this role. He was actually probably better than Biddle would have been. There was a main judge from the United States. Francis Biddle had, interestingly, he had taken over as Attorney General when Robert Jackson was appointed to the Supreme Court and then got fired by Truman, and then Truman, as a favor, let him do this job. It was the last important thing I think he ever did in his life. I think he was kind of bitter about that. He thought it would get him a good gig afterwards, but it kind of didn't. He thought he would end up on the Supreme Court, and he didn't. But he was very good in his role. Nikitchenko, I think I'm pronouncing that right, the Soviet judge. Rumor has it he spent an awful lot of time on the phone with Stalin asking how he should rule on things. So he didn't have a lot of freedom to rule on things on his own. He actually dissented from the final decision because several people were acquitted and he wasn't happy about it, or Stalin wasn't happy about it. The French were almost, they were there in name only, and the French judge, as far as I can tell, did nothing. There were also alternative judges. I'm not going to torture you with 4 more names. The alternative judges' jobs were to sit around and hope that the main judges didn't die or get sick. And they sat through the proceedings and didn't get to vote. So they really just hung out in Germany, which at the time wasn't so great. These are the prosecutors. As I said, Justice Robert Jackson was the chief prosecutor. Jackson hired 600 lawyers to do the work. There were 600 lawyers working to convict 23 people. It was quite the impressive show. Sir Hartley Shawcross, whose picture is also up there, was the chief prosecutor from the United Kingdom. He was actually probably, in terms of witnesses, he was probably the most effective lawyer they had. He was pretty devastating as an attorney. And the Russian and French prosecutors did about as much as the Russian and French judges. So this was, at the end of the day, it was really a sort of a US and UK show. This is just a quote I like from Robert Jackson. You don't have to write furiously. He gave Jackson, actually in some ways Jackson kind of stunk throughout a lot of the trial, but he gave an unbelievable opening statement. And it's really interesting that he says this because the wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated. You would hope that somebody who says that would make sure that they're never repeated, and unfortunately, as you've learned in this class, they've been repeated. And so that's one of the downsides of Nuremberg. But Jackson's opening statement was absolutely stirring. And if you're really bored some night, you can listen to all 28 hours of it. I think it's 4 days that it took him to give it, but parts of it are really excellent. So the prosecution case, Jackson had been a judge for a really long time. And so it had been a really long time since he'd actually cross-examined a witness, and he wanted no part of cross-examining a witness. And so what he said was, we will just devastate them with our documents. The bad thing about, or the helpful thing about the Germans, as it turns out, is this doing funky stuff again, is that they documented everything. They wrote down everything. And we had buildings full of documents that were incriminating. They kept a death book at Mauthausen, at the concentration camp, that actually outlined the death of almost 40,000 people, said how they died. It was very interesting because you would have 40 or 100 people dying the same minute on the same day, all of sudden heart attacks. It didn't say what they did, but it said they all died. And they documented it. The Einsatzgruppen in the Ukraine actually wrote out daily dispatches of their killings. I know I've been holding my water for a minute. I'm a little paranoid about it. They actually wrote out their daily killing logs. And so to figure out how many people the Einsatzgruppen killed, all you had to do was sit there with an adding machine and add up to 1,000,000-something 100,000. They said, 300 Jews killed in this town on this day. They documented everything. And so Jackson never really understood that part of this trial was about the show. It's not just about the evidence, it's about the show. And so he just said, we will devastate them with documentation. And it wasn't until members of the media stopped showing up and newsreels stopped reporting and people sort of lost interest that Jackson finally agreed, okay, we need to put on some witnesses, we need to show some video, we need to sort of liven this up a little bit. But he really had to be convinced. His main aim was to prove the war of aggression, because his argument was that you could convict them on the war of aggression because they had broken treaties. And treaties are actual laws, and so no one can argue that they're ex post facto. Even though treaties don't really have any mechanism through which you enforce them, he kind of liked it. The atrocities against the Jews, the Gypsies, and the others are sort of besides the point. Like it really took Jackson a long time to come around to the idea that that's what was on trial here. And it's sad that wasn't what he wanted to put on trial, but it really wasn't. This is the defendants sitting in the dock. They were there for almost a year. It was a really, really, really long trial. It made the O.J. Simpson trial look short. Now I'm really dating myself. Probably half of you never saw the trial. So I want to talk about a few of the defendants, and mainly I want to sort of group them together because really there was a typology of Nazis that they were looking to get at. And the first was the high-ranking Nazis. The highest-ranking Nazis, Goering was he was Hitler's second in command for a lot of it until the end of the war, but a lot of the Nazis that were most known to the world were either dead or on their way eventually to Argentina at this point in time, and so we didn't have them. And so we kind of had these stand-ins. And so the high-ranking Nazis, we had Rudolf Hess and Hermann Goering as our sort of high-ranking Nazis. And Goering was actually very well known to the American public. He was incredibly flamboyant as a human being. He was sort of the clown prince of the Nazi state. He used to wear these outlandish uniforms. They were like powder blue. He used to change them 3 times a day. I don't know why. He had sort of one of those bigger than life personalities, and he liked being on television. Not television. He liked being on the radio. He liked being in films. You saw him a lot. There's video of him at his estate petting a tiger. He had a pet baby tiger. He was a little nutty. He also sort of pilfered a lot of the art from France and brought it into Germany, and so he used to show off all these great artworks that he had actually stolen that he said he quote unquote bought. He also had a bit of a drug problem. When the Americans picked him up, He had 17 suitcases with him. One of them was filled with morphine pills. They counted them out. It was over 20,000 morphine pills. It's a lot. And he had hoped that while they put him on trial, they'd let him basically stay high the whole time. The Americans didn't. They took away his pills. He was a big man. He was about 5'8" and over 300 pounds. And the Americans also put him on a diet. So by the time he actually went on trial, if you see pictures of him on trial, all his clothing are really loose because they didn't let him get new uniforms. But it's really interesting that the Americans didn't take him very seriously because he was sort of this clown prince. And the minute they got the drugs out of his system, they found out he was probably the smartest of all the defendants. He was incredibly sharp and he was incredibly difficult to deal with at times. Rudolf Hess is a strange figure. He spent most of the war in an English POW camp. He had this crazy idea. He was actually, in 1940, he was Hitler's third in command. And he decided that England and Germany should get along. They should be buddies. And they were Aryans, we're Aryans. And so he stole a plane. He flew to Scotland. He asked to meet with the Duke of Hamilton, who he had met once at a cocktail party, so he figured they were friends. And he said, I want to meet with Churchill and I want to come up with an agreement so that we don't have to fight you on the Western Front and we can both fight the Soviet Union. And the English took one look at Hess and they said, we're putting you in a POW camp. And so then the Germans were left with a problem, which was, did Hitler actually send Hess on this mission? And so Hitler came forward and he said, Hess is crazy, he's insane, he's lost his mind, we knew he lost his mind. And Hess decided that if the Fuhrer said he was crazy, then he was crazy. And he decided to act crazy for the next 6 years. So he said he had amnesia. He didn't remember the flight, he didn't remember coming to England. He spent most of the war in an English POW camp writing letters to his wife, but claiming he didn't remember her. He said he just copied the name from the letters that he got. And he actually pled insanity at the trial. Another group of people that we put on trial were the propagandists. And these people were really the stand-ins for Goebbels, because he had also killed himself at this point in time. Julius Streicher wrote sort of a Jew-baiting tabloid newspaper, and he was really not very smart. Even the other defendants hated him. He was kind of a scumbag. They said his cell smelled bad. He refused to clean it. He was just an awful character. And he was also really dumb because in 1942, he got mad at Goebbels because he felt like Goebbels didn't talk to him at a cocktail party. And so he started questioning in his newspaper. He published an article claiming that that Goering was impotent. And that his child was actually somebody else's child. And Goering's number 2 in the Nazi party. And you're publishing stuff about him? Like, that wasn't very bright. And he was actually thrown out of the Nazi party after he did that. Alfred Rosenberg was sort of the Nazi philosopher. They also had a sort of the Nazi version of Rush Limbaugh, I don't know how else to put it, who was on trial at the same time. All these people were sort of the stand-ins for Goebbels. Because they couldn't catch him, so they figured they'd put these guys on trial. The henchmen were sort of the stand-ins for Himmler. Ernst Kaltenbrunner took Himmler's place as the chief of the security police, as the chief of the Gestapo eventually. Hans Frank was the governor general of Poland. So he was the one who, over 2 million Jews were killed in Poland alone, while Governor Frank was the governor of Poland. He was known as the Jew butcher of Krakow. Kaltenbrunner, the press really liked him because he looked like what you thought a Nazi should look like. He was like 6'3", he had blonde hair, he had blue eyes. I mean, you can see he looks mean. He had this huge scar across his cheek, and it was, you can't see it in a black and white photo, but it was like this deep purple color. And he claimed he got it in a fight. And during an interview with one of the prison psychologists, he actually admitted that he had been drunk one night and he ran his car into a tree, and that's how he got the scar, so it wasn't really that exciting. But he got a lot of press time because he looked like what they thought a Nazi should look like. But these were sort of the henchmen who actually who actually did the dirty work. The military commanders were put on trial because of the waging aggressive war. There were actually 4 military commanders that were put on trial. One of them was acquitted. Jodl and Keitel were number 1 and number 2 in the German high command, so they basically ran the army. And they were put on trial. Admiral Donitz was there also. He was the one who actually signed the surrender. The sort of slave drivers were there. These were the stand-ins for Eichmann. Eichmann, they thought was dead. Eichmann was actually, I'm not sure where he was in 46, but he eventually ended up in Argentina, and the Israelis captured him. I'll talk about that in a minute. The Israelis actually kidnapped him and took him back to Israel to stand trial. But these were, Reich Minister of Armaments and Munitions sounds like, okay, this is the guy who sort of makes sure everybody has guns. Well, actually what he did was make sure that there were slaves to make the guns. And Sauckel was his second in command, and it was Sauckel's job to make sure there were enough slaves to get to the factories to make the guns. And so they were put on trial. Speer is an interesting one. Well, most of these guys are kind of interesting. And they decided to also put some of the capitalists on trial. These are the Reichsbank president and also a former minister of economics and the minister of economics. Schott claimed he was just a banker, that he didn't know anything that was going on. And they actually found a letter that he wrote asking for that they needed more gold because they needed hard currency and they wanted to trade gold for hard currency. And could they round up some more Jews so that they could get more crowns from their teeth so they could have more gold to then turn into hard currency? So that's what kind of just a banker Schott was. The defense had several different sort of tacks that they were going to take. Goering was defiant to the last. When he actually went up to testify, the judge gave him a lot of leeway to sort of do whatever he wanted. And so for 2 days, he talked about the necessity of the Nazis taking over Germany, that everything that happened was sort of just an offspring of that necessity. And there was this big showdown between Justice Jackson and Goering, and everybody thought this was going to be the moment that Jackson really puts him in his place. And Jackson really showed how bad he was with a witness, and Goering actually, at best, it was a draw, but Goering certainly didn't have that, that moment where the defendant gets up there and goes, "Oh my God, you're right, I killed millions of people, I'm so sorry." Like, people were hoping for that moment, and it just never came. Goering was like, "We did what we had to do." Hess, as I claimed, said he was insane. They actually had a competency hearing in the court. One of the psychologists pointed out to Hess that if he was actually found insane, he wouldn't be able to come to court anymore and wouldn't be able to spend time with his friends anymore. And Hess went in front of the court and said, "Oh, guess what? I'm not insane. I remember everything." And then right after the trial, he spent life in prison, and he said, "I was just kidding at the trial. I'm really insane." And he actually, he spent life in prison. He lived to be in his 90s, and then he killed himself, which is, it seems odd to kill yourself when you made it into your 90s, but he did. There were a couple people who were repentant. One I buy, one I don't. Hans Frank was actually the Jew butcher of Krakow. He was actually quite repentant. He became a devout Catholic when he was in prison. Lots of people seem to find God in prison. He was one of them. And he was actually, he admitted what they did and actually felt really sorry about it. Speer also came forward and said he was really sorry for what happened. Most people are convinced he did that because he was hoping to get a lesser sentence, and he did. He only got 20 years. He ended up writing a best-selling book after he got out about his life. He was an architect, too. I'm telling that to my friend who's in the audience, who's an architect. And they were pretty repentant. The military men just said they were following orders. Sauckel and Funk said they didn't know what was going on. Sauckel claimed, "I treated my slaves/laborers really well. And what happened to them after I let them off the train didn't matter." And the main defense was sort of to blame Hitler, Himmler, Goebbels, and Eichmann. It was all their fault. At the end of the day, it didn't work so well, although it worked for some of them. There were 3 acquittals. 3 people actually got off completely and were let go. 11 defendants were sentenced to death by hanging. This really upset the military men. They felt that they should have been shot by a firing squad. That was considered a more honorable death. The others all got prison terms from 10 years to life. Very few of them served their entire prison terms. I'll explain why that happened in a minute. So the verdicts are handed down on October 1st, 1946. On October 13th, all the appeals were rejected. Took them a lot of time to do that. On the 15th, the day before he was going to be hanged, Goering committed suicide. He had kept a cyanide capsule in his luggage. He had hidden it away, and the Americans hadn't found it. And they think one of the Americans' guards actually took him to his bag and got him the capsule, and then he killed himself. He had asked to be shot instead of to be hanged, and when they didn't agree to it, he decided he would kill himself instead. The day after Goering committed suicide, they hanged 10 people. So what happened afterwards? As I said, there were 12 other trials that took place between 1946 and 1949. There were actually 30 trials that were originally planned. By 1949, the world situation had changed. Robert Jackson, after the trial, he went back to the Supreme Court. The judges went back to their jobs. They were sort of the A team, and the B team came to put on the other trials. People weren't as interested in these trials. Germany it was becoming fairly obvious that the Soviet Union and the United States didn't like each other very much anymore, and the Cold War had begun. And in 1949, the Soviet Union, I'm sure you guys don't remember that East and West Berlin used to be split. And Berlin was right in the heart of East Germany. And so the Soviet Union in 1949 actually blockaded West Berlin. They wouldn't allow Westerners access to West Berlin. They wouldn't allow foodstuffs to get in there. And so the West German government sort of went to the United States and the United Kingdom and said, look, all these trials are weakening us. Can you please stop? And the United States sort of made the tactical decision that it was more important to have Germany as an ally than it was to keep prosecuting Nazis. And not only that, in 1952, they actually created a clemency board and started letting the Nazis who were convicted at the Nuremberg trials out of prison. And so very few of the sentences actually came to fruition. The hangings took place, but a lot of people who got life only served 8 years. We decided that we needed some of these people for our own uses, and so really, Nuremberg as a trial just became not important to us in terms of our international relations. And so in 1949, it kind of comes to a halt. The Israelis in 1950 decided that the Jews were given short shrift at these trials, and they didn't like it very much, and so they passed a law. And the only thing in Israel that you can get the death penalty for is being a Nazi war criminal, is crimes against humanity. And they started chasing Nazis, and they caught one who happens to have his picture up there. That's Eichmann. In 1960, they tracked down Eichmann outside of Buenos Aires. He was actually living in a little crappy house with no electricity and no running water. And in the middle of the night, Mossad agents grabbed him, threw him in the back of they threw him in a cabin, made him sign a paper saying he was Eichmann, made him sign a paper saying he agreed to go to Israel, threw him in the back of a plane, flew him back to Israel, and put him on trial. They put him on trial for 15 counts of crimes against humanity, and they executed him. It's the only person in the history of the state of Israel to be executed. There were trials for what happened at Dachau and Auschwitz that were actually held in West Germany later on. There were times when the West Germans would suddenly decide that they weren't so happy with what went on in their past and wanted to reconcile it, and they'd go after people for a year or so, and then they'd stop. But for the most part, the idea of having an international criminal tribunal was done. And so from 1949 until 1992, the idea that the international community would sort of come together and try people for genocide and wars against and crimes against humanity wasn't going to happen. And then Bosnia took place, and the so-called ethnic cleansing in Bosnia. And this was the first time that it was a European nation who was doing, to a certain extent, what the Germans did, that they were killing people just because they were Muslim. And the European community in the United States decided that this was somewhat intolerable. And so they created in 1992 and in 1994 they started actually holding trials. They created the first International Court of Justice. And there's a great book by a guy named Gary Bass called To Stay the Hand of Vengeance. And it's all about international war crimes tribunals. And the analogy he uses is a baseball analogy. So if you're not a baseball fan, I'm sorry for my baseball analogy, but I am a baseball fan. And what he says is, if the Nuremberg trials was a Major League Baseball team, then every international war crimes tribunal since has been a pretty good small-town softball team. The amount of money that's been put into them, the prosecutors. I mean, you had a Supreme Court justice as the chief prosecutor. And every international war crimes tribunal since has been some pretty good human rights lawyers, but certainly not of Robert Jackson's stature. And the International Court of Justice for Bosnia actually did a somewhat admirable job in a symbolic way. And they did do a good job of going after the leaders. They did a pretty poor job of going after the people who actually did the killings. And part of that had to do with witnesses, but they convicted 161 people in the International Court of Justice. They convicted and sentenced 48 people to terms of up to life in prison. While the first trial, ironically, at the International Court of Justice for Bosnia was going on in The Hague, we had the Rwandan genocide. And the Rwandan genocide, I don't know that we've ever seen anything like it. The estimates are that roughly 800,000 people were killed in 100 days. I mean, think about that, 800,000 people. That's the size of San Francisco. It's a little bigger than San Francisco. In just over 3 months of the Rwandan conflict. And the world community didn't stop it. But they did decide that they needed to put the war criminals on trial. The problem with putting the Rwandan war criminals on trial is that they have estimated that somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 people actually took part in the killings. And they've been able to actually, they've caught 50,000 people who have been behind bars, some since 1994. So putting that many people on trial is incredibly difficult. So the International Criminal Tribunal only dealt with the leaders, and they had 50 trials. There were 29 convictions, but there was some question as to how to deal with these other 50,000 people. Oh, I haven't switched. Sorry, I'm not a PowerPoint guy. There we go. And so they couldn't figure out how is it that you're going to deal with all these people in the regular court system of Rwanda. And so the Rwandans have actually turned to what they call the Gacaca courts. Gacaca literally means waving grass, which makes no sense why they're called courts to me, but they claim it's because they're open-air courts. And basically the community comes together and they take the person from the community who's accused. They bring out their accuser. I heard of one example. They did it before a wedding. And this woman came forward and said, "You killed my son." And he came forward and said, "He didn't kill your son. I know this because it was my brother who killed your son." And then she came forward and said, "He's right. His brother killed your son. Let's go get his brother." So they go and get his brother. They let you go free because now there are two witnesses saying you didn't do it. They say, "You must have killed him." And they have a sentence. And that's how these courts work. And they've done this thing where they've sort of taken the people that were already arrested and put them into categories. And they've said that they'll put your sentence in, they'll have your sentence if you confess. And also the courts, the communities kind of decide what the punishment is. So they're sort of, they're about restitution. So if you get a sentence of 5 years, you might serve 2.5 years in prison and then do 2.5 years working for the community. And the idea behind it is that we're going to get some reconciliation for what's gone on here. The problem with it is you don't have a defense. All of the charges are drawn up by the government. The government is of the other ethnic minority now. There isn't much due process. You know, imagine standing out there and you going, oh, my brother did it. And you going, yes, his brother did it. Like, if you're your brother, you're pretty mad at that point, I would think. You know, and you let this guy go free, you know, how do we know whether he did it or not? It's just people coming forward. And some of these trials are taking place 15, 16 years after the actual events. So even these courts, which sort of people have put some hope in, have been problematic. In 1998, there was 148 countries. This is actually really quite important. 148 countries came together in Rome and created the International Criminal Court. It was the first time that had ever happened. So this wasn't just the victors after World War II. This was 148 countries coming together. And so these 148 countries come together and they pass a statute to create a new court called the International Criminal Court, which actually opens in 2002. There are now 114 states that are members of the International Criminal Court. Can anyone guess what country is not a member of the International Criminal Court? Us. We were one of the people who pushed for it. Can you guess why we're not a member of the International Criminal Court? What's that? No, not because of Kissinger. Because we didn't want Kissinger on trial? Maybe. But that actually brings up the reason why. We wanted an exemption. We wanted the International Criminal Court to not be able to prosecute Americans. And until the International Criminal Court agrees not to prosecute Americans, we won't join. And President Bush, and Obama has continued this policy, so I'm not trashing on Bush. I could trash on Bush, but I'm not right now. Bush said that no American soldier will be put on trial in an international tribunal. And Obama has shown absolutely no interest in joining. So we're not members. Israel originally signed on to it, and then they started getting investigated, and they said, yeah, we were just kidding. So they unsigned. The Russians have not signed on to it. And the International Criminal Court has been interesting as a symbol. It's hard to argue that it's been much of a success. There's been 5 official investigations in 9 years. If you notice, Kenya, Congo, Sudan, Central African Republic, and Libya, the investigation just opened up a few weeks ago. If you haven't noticed, Libya is having some problems. All these countries are in Africa. And Africans have gotten a little upset that the only people being investigated by the International Criminal Courts are in Africa. Worse than that, they have had 23 indictments and not a single conviction. They've had 1 acquittal. They have 4 trials in progress right now, but they haven't convicted anyone. So people have argued that the International Criminal Court is still, it's about the first world telling the third world how to act. People have even said it's about white people telling black people how to act. And that it's basically toothless because the big countries aren't a part of it. You know, you kind of want the United States if you're going to have an International Criminal Court. They have 4 people in custody right now who are on trial. And that's a picture, by the way, of the International Criminal Court. I had to stretch it. It's actually a prettier building than it looks like, but the picture kind of got stretched. I don't know why I'm telling you that. All right, so just to sort of wrap up here, these are some of the continuing issues about the war crimes tribunals. The biggest one is sort of, what were the lessons of Nuremberg? I kind of think, there were a lot of lessons of Nuremberg. I think one of the biggest lessons of Nuremberg is that we need to change our expectations of what you can do in situations like these. Our notions of justice in a criminal trial can't be put on these kinds of trials. So, let's say I decide I'm going to steal your bag. You're dressed nice. I figure you might have some cash in it. I steal your bag. I run off. You saw me doing it. You tell the Sonoma State Police that I did it. Your idea of justice is that A, I'm going to give back your stuff, and B, maybe I'm going to go to jail. Maybe I'm going to do some community service. That's our notion of justice in a criminal trial. Those notions of justice, that the person who actually pulled the trigger in a genocide is going to somehow serve time, those expectations in some ways are too high. In some ways, what the best we can hope for is to get the leaders and have sort of symbolic justice. At least that's what I think. I think it's really troubling that there isn't worldwide support for the International Criminal Court. I do understand the Americans' point, but the fact that the Americans think other people should sign on to it when they don't makes absolutely no sense to me. There's no way that you can sign on to a treaty like that and say, but we're exempt. So if you're going to have the International Criminal Court, have an International Criminal Court and make it real. I don't think we've ever decided what the point of these trials is. If the point is vengeance, I'm not sure that Churchill wasn't right. That you should start picking people off. That's vengeance in its own way. It's swift, it's fast, it's over. That's a vengeful nation. Are we trying to deter people from ever doing it again? I don't know how you do that. The death penalty in our country doesn't deter people from killing people. How is an international criminal tribunal going to deter people? Or is it about reconciliation? And if it's about reconciliation, maybe the way the Rwandans are doing it is right. There's probably a lot of innocent people who are going to get hurt by it, but maybe that's the price you pay for reconciliation. I don't know, honestly. And I think that we're uncomfortable with the uncomfortable relationship between law, justice, and morality. We want law to be just and moral, and it rarely is. There's legal, there's just, and there's moral. And if you can manage to get 2 out of 3 of those things in any criminal trial, you're doing pretty well. If you can get some semblance of all 3, I think you're doing great. Most of the time, you're lucky if you get 1. And I think that's it's something that we are uncomfortable with in our country, that fact that this is an uncomfortable relationship. And so I think that the biggest lessons that we can take from Nuremberg is the hope that if we keep trying, we might have better results, but also be realistic about what those results might look like. That's all I got. Thank you. I'm pretty sure that's the longest I've ever spoken in my life. I don't like to talk that long, and I didn't. So questions would be great.
I would like to point something out.
Sure.
And that Henry Morgenthau is the son of Hans Morgenthau, the American ambassador in Turkey during the Armenian genocide, who acted in such a noble way. He was Henry also?
Yeah, it's Henry Morgenthau.
No, I'm thinking Hans Morgenthau, the political son.
Yeah.
But there's another, the son of this Henry was also in the Clinton administration.
Yep. Yeah. When we were talking about Bosnia, that's true. Yeah.
I'm wondering, is there a difference between the World Court and the International Criminal Court?
I'm not sure what world court you mean.
One that had some action in the 80s. I know there was a criminal proceeding that Nicaragua took against the U.S.
Oh yeah. That's a United Nations creation. That's a civil court, not a criminal court. So the big difference is that that's going to be civil action, not criminal action. That has its own body of international law, but in terms of a criminal court, this is really the only one, and it didn't even start up until 2002. Yes.
Is there a difference
is
Turkey?
yes.
And why aren't they being investigated?
Because of the way the International Criminal Courts, the way the statute was written, first off, you can't investigate anybody for anything that happened before 2002 when it opened. So any past wrongs are out of bounds. And that was the way, the fear was that, that there were a lot of states who have done a lot of bad things. And, Israel didn't want to have to answer questions about things done, to the Palestinians. Turkey doesn't certainly want to answer. They wouldn't have signed on. Turkey, I'm not sure, was sort of an enthusiastic supporter, but all of the members of the European Union signed on, and so I think it was just good politics for Turkey to sign on. But they would not have signed on if they said that they were going to be investigated. The other thing is that the investigations are actually started by member nations. So for the most part, somebody in your government has to go, we did something wrong, come investigate us. And so that's a little weird quirk in their charter. The prosecutors can start investigations of their own, but it's a very tedious process to do that. And so the reason Libya actually happened so fast is there was a member of the Libyan government who actually sent an official letter to the International Criminal Court to start the investigation. I saw a hand. Yeah.
Do you think that if there was more worldwide support, it would really make a difference? Because, like with the UN, even though there's huge support, especially from like bigger nations like the United States, we really don't have a lot of power still with that. Like with Rwanda, they didn't do anything. So, would it really make a difference if the United States were a part of it?
How cynical do I want to be? Do I think it would make a difference? Oh, I'm sorry. She asked if I honestly thought it would make a difference if the Americans signed on to the International Criminal Court. I think symbolically, yes. I think these courts are important. I think they're important symbolically. I think they're important for reconciliation. And one of the things the United States could do, in part, is give more financing, and I think that would be important. The fact that we don't give them any money. I think the prestige would be greater. Do I think they're going to deter people from committing these atrocities? No. But I don't think that I don't think putting somebody in prison, for stealing a purse deters. If I get put in prison for murder, I don't think it deters you. So I think really what you're hoping for is that the people who live in these countries who lived through this feel some sense that something was done. But I don't know how you did. I study the criminal justice system in prisons. We don't deter people well. If we figure out how to do it, I'm all on board. But I've never seen us do it. Yeah.
Is there a reason that the Germans were so meticulous about keeping documentation so well?
My simple answer is because they're German. And Germans are really meticulous as a people. I don't mean that in a racist manner. I mean that like they're known for this. The other thing is that they were a highly developed, highly legalistic, highly bureaucratic nation. Okay, so it's like the United States. It's like when I want to take a group of students on a field trip. I take students to prison every couple times a semester. There are so many forms I have to fill out. The students have to fill out forms. Like, there are forms on top of forms. Yesterday I passed in a form. They said, that's the old form. We have a new form. This is what a highly bureaucratic world looks like. And the Germans were a highly industrialized, highly bureaucratic country. And so they were meticulous in their record keeping. Do you have a different answer than that? Or an addition?
Numbers on death records, that was a lot different than just killing people and not keeping track of it. And you were keeping 100 people working and with occupations. It's the same thing that happens here. The bureaucracy is growing at Sonoma State. You've all had experiences with it. Well, if you have forms, then you have to have someone who administers the form, someone who thinks it up, and 7 or 8 clerks who check them. So, although it wasn't the only motivation, I believe that one of the things was that it gave people work.
And if somebody figures out who at No Mistake creates the forms, I'd like to talk to them. So let me know.
Rob and I saw him when we were coming over here. It's the risk manager.
Risk manager? Okay, good. Yeah.
Does the criminal court actually have the power to go and get the people that they convict, like the Sudanese president? I know he was indicted. But
Her question was, does the criminal court actually have the power to go and get people? The answer is no. Even in the Bosnian, NATO refused to pick up war criminals in Bosnia. They said, even if they tripped over them, they're like, that's not our job. So that most of them are at large.
I think the slide said that 23 people had been indicted.
Yeah.
The criminal court, how come none of them have been punished? Nothing has come about.
Well, only 14 of them have been caught. So that's a problem. Getting evidence is a problem. These trials are really complicated and they take a long time. And so that's mainly why.
How does a society deal with living with huge numbers of perpetrators, as in Germany after World War II, Rwanda after the genocide, Bosnia afterwards, when they know, because not all the perpetrators have been convicted. They know that there are perpetrators everywhere.
That's out of my area a little bit. Maybe you know better than I do.
It's very difficult.
Yeah. I mean, that would have been my answer too. It's
We have someone who's a Rwandan who is very close to us, and she goes back every summer and often encounters the people who murdered her family.
Yeah, there was a wonderful radio program on NPR a while ago about the International Criminal Court, and they were talking about this guy who actually went to the International Criminal Tribunal and testified against these brothers who lived they were his next door neighbors, and he had witnessed them kill his son, his grandson, and his wife, and through for a whole host of reasons they were convicted, and then on appeal it was overturned because he was the only witness, and it doesn't matter, but it was overturned, and now they're living next door to him again. And they interviewed him, and he was just horrified by the fact that he has to see these people all the time. Now, they claim they didn't do it. And he's like, I grew up with them. They lived next door to me. What do you mean? I can't recognize the person I saw shoot my son? I would imagine it just must be devastating. Yeah.
Just a comment to add, when I went to Germany and visited Dachau, the thing that stuck out most to me was that at the end they, asked, well, like, how does this town live, knowing that their concentration camp was in their backyard essentially, and the lady told us that some of the Nazi, former Nazi party members and those who contributed to Dachau and its success still live in the town today. They're still there, and that people in the town know exactly who they are. They know what they look like. They know where they work. They see them at the grocery store, and it's it's absolutely horrifying for some of them to run into these people on a day-to-day basis and know that they were part of the concentration camp, and they sit there, and apparently every year they have a speaker at Dachau who talks about what happened for international people, and they'll come in and they'll raise hell essentially about promoting the Nazi idealism, and they'll just they're an older generation and they still think that it was appropriate, and there's no way you can tell the former Nazi members that they can't live there, and they do it out of spite and out of it's just, and I'm sure that happens almost in every single city, that there's been a concentration camp or death camp, but that
Sure.
really stuck out to me.
It's against the law in Germany to advocate Nazism.
Yeah, and they get kicked out every time, and but they do reach, I'm sure that they don't use those words
I'm sure
necessarily.
most of them are very old.
Yes,
Yeah.
they've got all definitely 80s, 90s, but it's
Yeah.
What's the name of the judge that the Soviet Union sent to the Nuremberg trials to oversee them?
Iona Nikitchenko. He actually, his biggest claim to fame afterwards, we had a spy plane that crashed in the Soviet Union, and the pilot of the spy plane was put on trial for espionage. He was the chief prosecutor of the American spy. What was it, Gary Bowers? Was that? Powers, Gary Powers. Random fact now. You can be a joy at cocktail parties like I am. Yeah.
The International Criminal Court, is that different from The Hague?
No, it's at The Hague. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.